Welcome
to
the
European
Institute for
Asian Studies.
Okay, well, good morning, all of you. Thanks for coming. And well, this morning we're actually going to talk about security dynamics in East Asia and the question of whether or not there is an emerging arms race. Security issues have been on the agenda in the Asia-Pacific, well, increasingly in the past few months and years, let's say, with the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the issues happening on the Korean Peninsula, the recent pivot of the US towards Asia Pacific again, and a lot of other things happening. And the question is whether there really is an arms race happening at some moment or not, and what are the implications for the EU, and is the EU prepared for that? So we have a nice panel today with Bruno Hellendorff from GRIP, from the, well, a researcher and a research institute who's going to focus much more on Southeast Asia and security issues there. We have Mr. Simón from the VUB, who's a postdoctoral researcher there, who's going to talk more about the European part of it. And we have David Fouquet, who's going to talk a bit more about well, the general issues and security in East Asia itself. I'd like to give the floor first to David to give like a general overview and get into the topic.
It's a topic we at the Institute already discussed perhaps a year and a half ago, again on a more general basis, and it's one I take a personal interest in, and I'd like to keep the dialogue and the analysis going on it, because I think it's a subject that isn't given adequate interest, hasn't received adequate interest in. Let me try to set a little bit the scene. Even constantly in recent months, the past year and a half or so, a lot of our Asian partners have been asking, requesting Europe to take a more active role in security issues in the Asia Pacific. I think most of them have in mind Europe supporting their point of view in the regional disputes over maritime sovereignty, maritime boundary issues. As you, I'm sure, are well aware of, there are a lot of debates and tensions in the region on, surrounding some of these sovereignty and boundary issues. But even as recently as yesterday, there was a conference on one of the major countries in Southeast Asia, and the subject came up of again, someone from that country was asking Europe to take a greater interest, to take a greater role in the region. And then there was a follow-up question, well, what do you want Europe to do specifically? What role does it have? Can it be? It's not a military power, as we know. It doesn't project military presence or power in Asia beyond a very limited shadow, let's say. There are arrangements. There's the five-power defense arrangement between Britain and a number of the countries in the region, and they sometimes conduct military exercises. Europe doesn't have the capacity to send aircraft carriers and marines and so on, but it does. We're going to have a conference in a few days on what what Europe does to assist countries in the region to deal with maritime security and piracy and so on. So it is present in relatively significant ways in the Asia-Pacific region, but not with the same visibility as the US, let's say, or some of the other major powers who are visibly present and visibly active in a prominent role in the region, with armed forces, with navies, with other capacity, and relationships, alliances. Europe doesn't have that kind of presence. But, interestingly enough, one area where Europe does play what I esteem to be a significant role is in arms transfers, arms sales. It's not, again, it's not the most active, not the most important provider of arms to the region. Most of the work, the pioneering work that's been done on this, has been done by the Stockholm Institute for Peace and Peace Research, CIPRI. I know it by its acronym more than I do, but anyway, they do a lot of work. They're the only ones roughly with the capacity, and they've devoted enough personnel power to really examine this. And they came out last year with their annual report on arms transfers, and they noted that for the first time, Asia was the leading importing region in the world, which had surpassed the Middle East, which had traditionally been the destination of choice for the manufacturers in the West, and they had the Middle East had been the leading customer. But now the leading customer are the Asian countries, or at least they were during that period studied from 2007 to 2012, I believe. And in Southeast Asia, if I remember correctly, but as I said, Bruno will go into this much more in much more detail. The increase in imports went up something like 169 or 70% over that period. So Southeast Asia is entering, and certainly in what may be called a military modernization period. And in this area, Europe has a significant role. I think, again, the United States, Russia, China are the leading suppliers of armaments. But I've looked at the list of sales transfers to the region, and repeatedly Europe shows up. And it may be what we call the big ticket items. They could be submarines, military aircraft, but frequently below the surface, there are also a significant number of transfers that take place in what are called light weapons. These can be some artillery or mortars below a certain dimension, rifles, other hand equipment, or there are a lot of aircraft engines, submarine engines, electronic systems that are required equipment for these major platforms. And there is also a significant amount of traffic going from Europe in used second-hand weapons. Weapons where our military has upgraded and they're trying to sell it off to other customers. Some of it happens, ironically, as we speak. The Paris Air Show is going on, and it's a significant event in the arms transfer world every 2 years, where people buy and sell aircraft, radars, all the equipment. And I've attended some of these in the past, and every alternate year there's what's called Eurosatori, also outside of Paris, which deals with land equipment. So armored personnel carriers, tanks, artillery, that's where that's bargained or negotiated or transferred. So a lot of it is happening. What I'm interested in is the policy dialogue that may or may not take place surrounding these arms transfers. We have a code of conduct on that supposedly restricts or creates a certain sense of responsibility over transfers of armaments from Europe to all other partners. But it's not a completely transparent operation. I know that sometimes there are requests for licenses that are denied in one country. There's some cases that get a certain amount of media attention in Germany about transfers to the Middle East, and they create a certain amount of controversy. I think on some occasions, some countries have rejected licenses to export to certain countries, and then another European country fulfills the order. So it's not completely transparent how those decisions are made, how many are made, even within Europe. So I'm a little bit concerned that in the first place, this is happening without oversight. I'm not even sure our parliaments have appropriate oversight over these transfers, because sometimes they leak in the press, but they weren't preceded always by discussions, debates, certainly not in open hearings in many of our parliaments. The second area of concern is the policy implications, the policy consequences of selling arms in regions where there is some degree of tension. Is Europe contributing? Well, we talk about arms races. I diplomatically stay away from that because the military, the diplomats, and government officials don't like that term in any way. They say, we're just modernizing our armed forces to cope with rising challenges or rising threats of pirates or a perceived rival. So, okay, every country has the right to do this, but conversely, I'm not quite sure whether there's a blank check for supplier countries to supply arms from the big ticket items, from submarines and fighter aircraft. We're probably going into also the drones at some point or another. Europe doesn't have very much capacity, but That's an area of future development, I would say. Anyway, but as I was indicating, there is a lot of traffic going on in artillery, personnel carriers, tanks, brand new or second hand, that can have an important role in the balance of power in the region, certainly in a region where there is some tension, there is some friction, and there is some rivalry. As I indicated, and we'll hear again and again, I'm sure, the countries in the regions are increasing their purchases, increasing their military capability. For what reason? Well, we do know why. That's not the subject of this seminar, but is it a role that's adequately understood in Europe to be a major supplier in this area of some tension? The UN even has some restrictions on supplying arms to areas of tension. It's usually when there's a shooting conflict where it's prohibited. But in certain, I think it would be responsible for supplier countries to have a genuine, an open policy debate. Incidentally, we had asked someone from the European External Action Service to come here and perhaps, well, get into the discussion. I'm not quite sure whether they would have lifted the lid entirely on the policy implications, whether they're really examined by our diplomats, our diplomatic services, our parliaments. Okay, I think that probably winds down my presentation. I know that our friends at CIPRI again in Stockholm have told me they are conducting ongoing research specifically on the Asian issue. I see that Bruno has written what seems to be an excellent paper on the subject, so I think it's up to the other speakers on this panel to carry the discussion forward. Thank you.
And thank you, Lynn. Thank you, David, for the excellent introduction. And after hearing your presentation, I figured I should have brought my picture from Eurosatory after all. But it's going to be for next time. So an arms race. Oh, okay. An arms race is a term which is not neutral at all. I think it's important to highlight that fact right from the outset. An arms race is something we call an arms race any dynamic that reminds us of what happened in Europe in 1913. Bearing that in mind, I will go on focusing on Southeast Asia. Why Southeast Asia? Well, because to me, the region has a lot to offer in terms of understanding the current dynamics, in terms of hard power, in terms of military spending and arms transfer. And I think Europe should learn a lot of how Southeast Asian countries relate to the broader dynamics of China rising, of the US so-called pivot, and so on and so forth. And this will be done in 3 steps. In the first, I'll sketch out the context, which is basically focused on the rise of China and the US so-called pivot, as I said. Then I'll dwell into the military spending patterns that we can observe in Southeast Asia and the arms transfers, basing my observation on CIPRI data. And on the third, I'll throw on the table some additional elements, and hopefully that will provide some food for thought and stimulate debate afterwards. So last year, global military spending decreased. It was the first time since 1998. It decreased by 0.5% to reach still a high total of $1.75 trillion. So that's still quite high. What that means is not that everybody's spending less money on the military. What that means is that the US and the EU are spending less money on their military. In every other parts of the world, military spending is growing, and that's especially true in Asia and Oceania, right here. Since 2008, actually, Asia is spending more money in its military than Europe. And if you look at the figure, you see that the bulk of that rise comes from Northeast Asia. And I think, well, it's needless to say that the bulk of this particular rise in Northeast Asia comes from China. This is another way of looking at things. This is the figure for 2012, where you see that on the whole of Asia, well, the Northeast Asia total in military spending is as high as 70%, and 70% of that is China. Still another way of looking at things. I think I'll go quite fast. Basically, this shows what frightens us to some extent, to see that China is raising its military budget by something like around 10% every year to reach very important levels. That means also that China may surpass the US in terms of military spending as soon as 2034 or something, according to some scenarios. Of course, this has a lot of caveats in it. This is EIAS estimates, and it's based on various scenarios. China may as well never outgrow the US in terms of military spending. Who knows what happens? But the trend is clear. The US is spending less money, even though they're spending less money because of their withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan, not so much in terms of acquisition budgets and weapons development budgets, which still remain quite high. And while China is spending a lot of money on its military, I think it's important to state here that, again, as David said, it's quite normal for a big country to invest a lot of money in their military, or at least it's not forbidden, or it's not a problem in itself. The problem comes when they're developing weapons, particular types of weapons, that may appear aggressive, that can spark tension, that can spark misunderstanding in their neighborhood. And that's the case in point is, of course, the aircraft carrier. I remember a few years ago, I can still remember that the Chinese officials or scholars saying very confidently here in Brussels, China will never acquire an aircraft carrier. Why? Because, well, it would make us look aggressive, and we want to keep good relationship with our neighborhood. Everyone knew by then that they were refitting the Vrije, that aircraft, but, you know. And what is really striking about that case is not so much that they did launch it, is that when they put the aircraft carrier on sea trials, well, the event was covered widely in the Chinese media. And the nationalist tone of the media reports was quite striking, at least to the external observers. When you take the perspective of Southeast Asia, what was striking about that? Again, it's not so much that China is spending a lot of money on its military. That's not a problem. What can appear as threatening to those immediate neighbors was the development, for instance, of LPDs, landing platform docks, so amphibious ships. This is big. This is huge, actually. This ship is one that just conducted a few months ago exercise in the southern of the Spratleys Island in the South China Sea. This is 80 kilometers away from the Malaysian coastline, but 1,800 kilometers away from the Chinese coastline. And yet Malaysian people, a Malaysian state didn't do anything, even though they were in the run-up to the election. Another very sensitive case, so to speak, is the development by China of the missile, the DF-21D. For those who know it, a lot of things have been written and said about it, still remains shrouded with a lot of contradictory assessments, and the development of submarines, fifth-generation fighters, and so on and so forth. So, again, what I want to stress here is not that the Chinese military modernization is problematic. That's not the issue. The issue is that its modernization may appear somewhat shrouded, somewhat obscure to its neighbors. And when they see that the doctrine that accompany it, that gives more and more space to power projection, that may spark some tensions or concerns. And since 2008, 2009, China has increased, I would say, assertiveness in its territorial claim in the South China Sea, has sparked some additional tension to it, which were quite lessened before that due to China's good neighborhood policy that was launched in 1997. We have a lot of time for Q&A, so I'm going fast. If you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it afterwards. But anyway, that's the big issue in terms of hard power and China rising. The Americans' response to that, and I think most of you are familiar with the big picture, is comprehensive. So what we called at some point pivot is more like a comprehensive rebalancing effort. The US says we are a Pacific power and we're pursuing our interest in a comprehensive manners. So what that means is that they are basing, Marines in Northern Australia, Darwin. They're basing LCS, so littoral combat ships, in Singapore, developing a new concept, military concept, joint operational access concept. I can detail that if you would like. But it's also about Barack Obama going to Southeast Asia as his first diplomatic trip after a re-election. It's also about the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's also about going to Burma and developing a relationship with a country that was supposed or considered to be in China's orbit for a long time. So what that means is that Southeast Asia seems, to the external observer, at least from Europe, I would say, my idea would be that Southeast Asia turned somehow as a playing field, as a playing ground for geopolitical rivalry between China, which is rising, and the US, which is trying to maintain its premise in the region. This image has, well, some value in terms of, interpretation, perception, whatever, but what is really important now is to look into military spending in Southeast Asia. Why? Because then you can see the agency of Southeast Asia. Not so much Southeast Asia as, a playing ground, but as various actors playing different cards, playing different strategies, again, and trying to cope with a different challenge that comes with the rise of China, that comes with the US pivot, and that comes with a confrontation of both. How much time do I have left? All right. So, when we talk about rising military spending in Southeast Asia, you can see from the figure there that indeed it looks like it's going up. But basically what's going really up is Indonesia's military spending and Vietnam. Singapore remains quite stable. Philippines as well, Brunei as well. And when you talk about, Cambodia or Laos, it doesn't deserve to be really but on the same page than the others. So the picture is quite mixed, with some countries investing a lot of money and more money throughout the last decades, such as I said, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others spending a lot less. At the same time, if you compare that to the US or China, it's still, it doesn't match quite well. I mean, Vietnam is often supposed to be the country that is most concerned with China's rise, at least in the South China Sea territorial dispute. But its military, so it can explain to some extent why its military spending has gone up so high. But not Indonesia. Indonesia doesn't have so much of a problem with China's territorial claims. It has some, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't explain that. And when you look at the Philippines, it has, which also has problems with China on that, it's not matching at all. So the reason and motives behind military spending patterns in Southeast Asia have to be more complex than just coping with the rise of China. As a matter of fact, this shows clearly that the growth of their military budget has been very stable over the last 20 years or so, and it remained below their economic growth. that is even more striking when you look at the picture, the figure in relative terms. In percentage of GDP, military spending in Southeast Asia has gone down and not up, meaning that military spending is driven mostly by economic growth, not so much about answering immediate threats. Or at least that's what the figures show. If you compare to what's happening in China and in the US, you see that half of Southeast Asian countries spend relatively more than China, but half less, but none as much as the US. So again, we have to be very moderate about the idea we get about military spending rises in the region. But again, here, just like in the Chinese case, figures, big figures, and the military spending figures do not tell us much about if there is an arms race or anything. An arms race is really about the perception, about mutually reinforcing dynamics of military modernization that can spiral out of control, impact of international relations, and eventually pave the way for open conflict. What is interesting, again, here is the import, as David made clear, of weapons. What types of weapons are acquired by those countries? And it has to be said that it's a lot, most of it is in the forms of high-end military hardware, such as submarines, which are extremely expensive, which are extremely hard to operate and to use in an effective manner. So the bulk of it all, all those imports by Southeast Asia, 89% actually, is either essentially maritime or potentially maritime equipment. 52% is about ships, stuff like that, and the 30 other % are boats, radar, and missiles. So what that says is that there is a lot of other issues going on, such as the issues of prestige. Having a submarine is something that, give credit to your army. If you need it, it's also not against pirates. Submarines are not useful against pirates. They are not useful to the many non-traditional threats that are often used as a justification for rising military budgets. They're, above all, instruments destined to deterrence, instruments to control the seas. So this is not so much about, as I said, countering the immediate non-traditional threat. It is about prestige, status, dealing with a more and more assertive China to some extent, and also getting a higher geopolitical weight and stake in the region. So, how much? All right. So a lot of things can be said here. I won't tell them all, but the QA is there for it. Many drivers are combining to account for that, for the various rises and the various types of weapons acquired in Southeast Asia. I think I've made it somehow clear in the document I provided to the Institute. But here I would just want to highlight prestige issues. I just wanted to play the history card and talk about the tribute system that we often heard in academic circles, and that the old thesis of is Asia's future will be its past? Will Asia's future be its past? Will it be Europe's past? And that's what we think when we use the term arms race. Well, what is interesting, for instance, in the Vietnamese case, which should not be generalized too much, but Vietnam throughout its history has been conquered or confronted to Chinese assertiveness, military assertiveness. It has been conquered, it has been occupied, it has been part of the Chinese world system, but every time Vietnamese drove away Chinese armies, they reestablished links with Beijing or the Imperial Palace, wherever it was, saying we're accepting a tribute system between us. So we officially recognize your prestige, we respect the empire, and so on and so forth. So this is important in the way that today history sheds a lot of interesting light on what's happening in terms of military development. Southeast Asian countries built a deterrence capability, not for itself or in itself for its own value, but in conjunction with diplomacy, something they've been doing for a long, long time. If military buildup of what I talked is part of a broader effort to build up their credibility, it comes along diplomacy, saying, okay, we recognize the importance of China. And what we do is not so much about countering the threat of China, it's about negotiating with it and saying, okay, we want to keep our autonomy. So basically, this entire buildup has to be understood not so much as an arms race. Some elements of it are present, that's for sure, but it is above all a capacity of deterrence that is part of broader international relations, broader strategies that have to be understood properly by the EU if it wants to wait in the region. And that's going to be my conclusion. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Before starting, just let me thank the European Institute for Asian Studies for the invite. It's great fun to be here to speak about such a timely and hot topic. No, I've been asked to keep my presentation to 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to do that, particularly since it's already quarter to 11. And as Lynn already said, I'm going to concentrate on the implications of all this for Europe. So I'm not going to zoom in on specific regional dynamics, Southeast Asia, East Asia, specific contingencies. We can do that during the Q&A. In recent years, we've seen a rise in military spending across Asia preside over a process of military modernization in that continent, and both David and Bruno have spoken about that in detail. And of course, Asia's military modernization is sort of the natural consequence of its economic development, which is a trend that has been underway for a long time, and I would argue we can trace it as far back as the second wave of globalization in the 1970s, and perhaps more immediately to the collapse of the Cold War system. But over the last few years, and Bruno was alluding to this fact, the global financial and economic crisis has sort of accelerated Asia's economic and strategic rise, I would say. So both economically and strategically. Economically, because so far the crisis has hit the West the hardest, both Europe and the United States, and has therefore accelerated Asia's economic catching up. And strategically or militarily, because and Bruno has already alluded to this, Asia's ongoing military transformation must be placed within the broader context of defense spending reductions in Europe, and more recently so in the United States. So I'm sure you've all heard by now that for the first time in some 200 years, in 2012, combined defense spending in all Asian countries overtook that of Europe. So this sort of leads to the main theme that I want to touch upon during the presentation, which is that we must place the rise of Asia within the context of Europe's demilitarization. Okay, and this is very important. And I want to cover two sort of interrelated points here, which are very important and that's central to the message that I want to convey. The first one is that Asia's increasing centrality in global geoeconomics and global geopolitics, and the process of military modernization that most Asian countries are undergoing sort of underscore a very important fact, which is that military power will remain an indispensable element of international relations in the 21st century. Okay, so this is the first sort of main point that I want to make. And the second point is that the ongoing emphasis on defense budget cuts in Europe and Europeans sort of clinging to mantras such as normative power or the comprehensive approach underscores another inescapable fact, which is that Europeans are increasingly unprepared for the kind of world we're walking into, both in terms of capabilities and most importantly and most immediately, I'd say, mentally as well. And this is sort of the key point that I want to make. Okay. Now I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that that the big theme right now in European foreign policy and strategic debates is that the U.S. rebalancing or pivot towards the Asia Pacific means Europeans will have to step it up to the plate and play a bigger contribution in providing security in their own immediate neighborhood, right? And I would say that of special importance, the neighborhood is in a narrow sense of the word, because Europeans, when they speak about the neighborhood and security in the neighborhood, and you can, and I think CSDP missions sort of illustrate this fact, this narrowness. Europeans refer to the geographical space running from the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa all the way through the Sahel, Maghreb, Mediterranean, Red Sea, onto the Gulf of Aden. So not even the Persian Gulf is considered to be part of this strategic neighborhood, I would say. Now, the need to prioritize the neighborhood clearly implies that Europeans don't have much strategic bandwidth left to deal with Asia. So it has obvious implications in terms of European perceptions of Asia. And the question is that, the irony here is that Europeans do actually recognize that the rise of Asia and the prospect of mounting geopolitical competition there are the driving features of the global geopolitical environment. And I think this seminar is actually a good example of that fact, but also other seminars in town, okay, where the Asian theme is increasingly prominent. And I think Europeans also actually acknowledge that the security of the global sea lanes of trade and communication is a vital European interest. However, for some reason which is not quite clear to me, well, it is quite clear to me, but I don't agree with the trend. Europeans sort of tend to look at Asia as an economic, or at best a diplomatic priority. Okay, no direct strategic role is envisaged for Europeans in Asia. So I think Europeans' vision of their own strategic role east of Suez, if you want to put it that way, is limited to playing a supportive role to the United States in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. remains the key security anchor in the Persian Gulf. It's also it's limited to low-end missions such as fighting piracy in the Gulf of Aden, and for some countries such as France for policing their maritime domain in the southwestern Indian Ocean. But that's it. It's limited to that. And I think, obviously, the political sentiment behind this sort of neighborhood-only approach to strategy in Europe is, of course, understandable, right? I mean, defense budget cuts and the worsening financial situation in Europe means it will be increasingly difficult for Europeans to maintain the kind of naval capabilities, because Asia is primarily a maritime environment geopolitically. So their financial difficulties will make it increasingly challenging for Europeans to maintain the sort of naval capabilities to project power and tip the balances, the geopolitical balances in Asia, although they still do have pretty formidable naval capabilities by global standards. But I think the problem is, the main reason why Europeans are increasingly unable to deal with contingencies in Asia is ongoing uncertainty in Europe and in the neighborhood, ongoing uncertainty about the EU's own political future, and growing volatility in the broader Middle East. Okay, and which is, by the way, further compounded by America's will to offload security responsibilities in the broader neighborhood. Okay, so to sort of conclude, or before concluding, I'd say that the new mantra in European strategic circles, back in the 1990s, it used to be the soft power trumps hard power, and the soft power, it's more important than hard power, and so on. And the new mantra right now is that the neighborhood is more important than the beyond, or than the global level, or than Asia. So why worry about Asia when there is so much to do in Europe and the neighborhood, right? This is the emerging consensus. It turns around the idea that Europeans would do very well to keep their strategic energies to their own neighborhood and look at Asia primarily through an economic and diplomatic prism, or a defense industrial one at best. I think Britain is to some extent an exception here, and we can talk about that during the Q&A. But let me just conclude by underlining the two main problems that I envisage, the two fundamental problems that I envisage in relation to this consensus that Europeans should focus on the neighborhood. The first problem is that strategic competition will be a central feature of Asian geopolitics. And this is something that is increasingly acknowledged by most Europeans. And this very fact actually challenges the notion that Europeans can remain economically or diplomatically relevant in Asia unless they have the ability to lever their military power to affect that region's strategic dynamics. And the reason for this is actually very simple. In an increasingly competitive strategic environment in Asia, the overarching concern of all Asian countries will be to maximize their security. And this will be more and more the case as time rolls on. And this means that when looking for economic and diplomatic partners, East, Southeast, South Asian countries, big, medium, and small, will look past economic profit, and they will put a premium on developing relationships with countries that bring them both economic and political and strategic value. Okay, and so the implication is that unless Europeans are actually able to play a strategic role in Asia, their economic presence and their diplomatic reach in that region will be unsustainable in the medium and long run. Okay, it might be sustainable now. We might get one cycle of defense procurement when it comes to arming those countries. But further down the road, it will be unsustainable unless Europeans are able to project strategic power to the region. I don't get into the question of to do what, because that's a question of political strategy. I'm saying that it will just be impossible for Europeans to have a strategy at all. And the second reason why this sort of consensus that Europeans should focus on the neighborhood is flawed is geopolitical interconnectivity. Okay, economic, technological, and strategic dynamics emanating from the Indian Ocean and from the Pacific Ocean will increasingly determine the shape and the evolution of parts of the European neighborhood, including the Middle East, including Africa, including the Arctic. So it remains unclear to me how is it exactly that Europeans will be able to exercise a sustainable strategic influence over their immediate neighborhood while ignoring adjacent geopolitical regions whose economic, political, and strategic developments will have a deep transformative impact upon their own neighborhood. Because, I mean, presumably the same logic, or at least that's what I think, presumably the same logic that leads Europeans to conclude that developments in their own neighborhood affect the security and prosperity of their homeland should lead them to think that developments beyond the neighborhood affect the stability and political dynamics of their own neighborhood. So I think that implying that Europeans should find a strategic niche in their neighborhood is just as flawed as implying that Europeans should find a niche in civilian power or soft power. I think small powers find niches out of sheer limitations and necessity, but big powers have to think globally, both functionally and geographically. So yeah, that was the main sort of conclusion that I wanted to leave out there.
Hey everyone, if you liked the video, make sure you subscribe so you never miss out on a video again. It's right here.